What is architecture? The definition of space? We should probably include the articulation of space as well. In basic form, a point makes a focus, a series of points makes a line, a series of lines makes a plane, 3 planes can start to define a volume, and 6 planes can enclose a volume. 4 planes can enclose a volume, but it makes very little usable space. But then the Egyptians weren't doing a whole lot inside their pyramids, apart from that initial death throes of the parties that they used to hold, I understand. Or were tomb parties just a load of nonsense, and it was just such an honour to be buried with your pharaoh? You jump at the chance. Enclosure is securing, a definite control of space. You could almost say that the delight of architecture comes when the control of that security is getting released. A defined space creates an environment, and that environment has the interaction of heat, light, air and water, and the more playfully each of these can be done, the greater they contribute to the overall architecture. There's a difference between architecture and articulation of the built form. Articulation of the built form, in all its manners, certainly does act as the delight to the eye, and texture can stimulate touch as well. But there are so many other variations of stimulation of the senses that architecture can provide to enrich our lives and our encounters. How are different life forms integrated as well as just earth, fire, air and water? If you're bringing the outside inside, can you feel the flow of air? Can you hear the trickle of water? The play of light, or is it just block? Colour? Is fire the orientation of the life forms in the winter? Birds? Another familiar fauna as pets. Are they caged? Is a conservatory really the only way of bringing the outside inside? Transitions, verandas, roofless pagodas. Integrating renewable technologies. Water, solar, ideally needs to be where it's going to be used. Photovoltaic electricity gets hot and radiates. But a huge part of architecture is how the spaces flow, how the spaces can be used, how they evolve over time, and the cultural meaning in their use and layout. Restrictions, options and interactions, controlled and designed. Is it culturally significant to you that your staff or your opposite sex is separate to you and has separate circulation? Need it be communicating equal status or identical status, but different? There are, of course, legal restrictions. You can no longer live with your agricultural animals, which for some clients might intrinsically bring down the architectural quality of their grand design in Stroud or Wales. But architecture should be about combining so many diverse and competing elements harmoniously, or at least to create a reaction or emotion, feeling. Commercial buildings, and sadly I'm including schools and universities in that, areas needed a set. The budget is naive, and the imagination, soaring delight that architecture can add is another layer on top of utility that never gets added and hardly considered. Residential buildings, Georgian architecture is often considered very livable these days, very adaptable. If I take you to the conflict, you'll be familiar with the triangulation of a kitchen, so you're working very efficiently. Architecture and beauty is often perverse. Double height space. It's so wasteful. You could have 2 floors in there. Atria. Or just not fill it all in and do ventilation. And most of you as a residential client, how long do you want to take in your transition from inside to outside space? How earthy do you want your inside? It's a battle. Getting an architectural result is a battle. It's not just a built form. You have to wrestle people, not literally, physically, into a more beautiful environment. You have to wrestle, not physically, the population into a sustainable environment. Can you afford not to pay forward your electric bill and your volume lifts the spirit? Now, is this kinetic sculpture architecture? Is the base building, or could it ever have been architecture? Yes, it certainly could, if it was the first of its type, or perhaps the first use of materials in a specific way, or first use of a system build, a way of putting those materials together. Even the build process itself can make it architecture. Now, since the advent of computers, there's an architecture to the interconnectivity of computers. I think this is partly what's to blame for architecture being referred to as a structure, which isn't really the case. Architecture is something higher than just a building, a way of enclosing a volume, and probably at the time this particular building was the cheapest way of enclosing a volume. It's hardly usable as a warehouse even, for the wine lodge that's underneath it. The large windows and large heat loss would be a band down in temperature terms for that precious product that loves consistency, but I'm digressing to the client, not the architecture. An enlightened client is so important to good architecture. Willing to spend money on that refining process, essentially. Something that'll function is one thing, something that is beautiful and engaging, another process of refinement. How do you enlighten the client? They probably either come that way or they don't, but I suspect a lot of architects lie to their clients that it's going to cost this much, and then later it costs substantially more. Legacy, you might possibly try and engage. I'm going to try and aim for education. It can't be argued that this kinetic sculpture doesn't bring the outside in. It really does, to the point of the building not being able to function. And the angles of the forces and the number of engineers calculating those is really quite artful. That half of that floor given over to, well, it's 2 floors, isn't it, but given over to outside semi-public space. Well, would you need a handrail, glass handrail around? It's a bit noisy, quite honestly, inside. It would disturb a wine bar type environment. And while that 100 millimetres between balustrades is so that a baby's head won't fit through, there aren't going to be children in a wine bar, but drunken people act like children. So there'll need to be that handrail that you don't see on domestic staircases, open-sided in some Hollywood loft where it just zigs, the stair just zigs and zags all the way up to the next floor. But even glass is a barrier. I think it's the angles that I appreciate the most of this kinetic sculpture, and the mechanism isn't overly intrusive, even with those very dramatic angles that it managed to get in its 360 revolution. And of course, just the basic ambition of it all, the scale and audacity. It brings the whole street and the whole area into the building. To try and analyse it, you get distracted by it. There have been attempts as part of BREEAM classifications of buildings, which incorporates environmental concerns a lot, to try and quantify the quality of architecture. And planning has tried to get down on paper what constitutes good architecture. Planning meetings do the same, but in words, people, their client, the architect, if they attend, are often not listening to what the planners are trying to tell them. One of the most subtle, perhaps, that I've come across is a burgage. Who knows what a burgage is, really? It's that how the land was divided, say on a high street, big Marks and Spencers or something, takes up several of what were old slivers of long buildings. But probably was a little shop and they used to keep a pig at the bottom of their garden hundreds and hundreds of years ago, say, when the first King Charles lost his head. Just showing some sort of delineation in the facades, not in the plan of the building, just some delineation in the facades of the wide building to show that there's been some understanding of the history of the site. One of those ones when I had to explain subtlety to my boss, and all they really were, they were happy with structural glass fins on the outside of the building, on those lines. Previously there'd been fiberglass pane window type scoops that were attempting to do a similar sort of thing in the 60s or 70s style. I know there's some amongst you saying, do we owe anything to what has gone before? Contextual design is the harmony and manners that we aspire to, and that in no way involves any sort of pastiche. Planning policy guidance, planning policy statement, paragraph 80 it is now. It's changed its number and changed its wording slightly, but essentially the same thing. Britain isn't the same as everywhere. Much of Europe, if you've got a plot of land, you can build on it. Often the size of the building is related to how big an area of land you've got. So if you want to build your version of Downton Abbey, but in a completely different modern style, you need a big or acreage or hectareage, I suppose I should say. Much of Britain isn't so rural. There's a lot of sites of special scientific interest and conservation areas. These are rural conservation areas, not towns. But there is still scope for some rich fella to go and build their version of what they consider to be the modern mansion in the middle of nowhere. They needn't be constrained by if it's close to a bus route or something and so suitable for development. There have been a lot of examples of clients getting architects to build these many and varied styles. Some defining space, a bit like Jenga. Others making an idolatry of a little farm building and then burying the rest under the ground. Obviously the content of the architectural proposal, the report, is important, but the planners will expect to see something that has cost a lot of money. The client must care about it enough to spend a lot of money on it. That includes the initial reports. You can factor in £100,000 just for the consultants and the reports and making the case. You also need to factor in a considerable period of time and assess that your architect has got the legal brain for interpreting whole paragraphs and pages of planning jargon that often just boil down to 1 or 2 words or a paragraph. And you can make a case for almost anything. It cannot be underplayed enough how important sustainability and carbon footprint is in trying to get anything close to a guarantee for new development these days. It's just another cost that you have to pay forward, just the same as the planning reports and the consultants' reports. And it's really close to foolish to be casting either of these aside and standing there shouting, I want, so I should have. The government planning authority is not your mother, or the teachers that you paid for.